Welcome to Food Slaying. My name is Michelle and I am your host. And today we're talking about who owns what on our plates. There's so much to this story that it goes back to the Nixon era and to the United States Secretary of Agriculture in the 1970s, all the way up to current day. Now, obviously, that's a span of at least 4 decades, so I won't be going too deep, but suffice it to say, there's a lot that's happened in that span of time, and we, as consumers, along with our animal, insect, and microorganism counterparts, have paid an enormous price. Of course, not just talking about money. But what we're going to talk about is the landscape. We're going to do a little name dropping across some of the primary food products and industries that most of us eat food from on a daily basis in an effort to highlight the magnitude of the consolidation of our food supply chain and also highlight the sheer fact of the illusion of choice that we all see the minute we step through those supermarket doors. We'll also dive into the impacts of this consolidation that continues every day. So you might want to grab a cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and enjoy the ride. Because by the end of this episode, I'll have just one question for you. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, then you know that question is cui bono. You probably already know the answer, but let us not rush to judgment because there's a lot here to digest. So, I also want to thank one of my listeners, Michelle, also spelled with one L, who requested this episode a few seasons ago. And it's a huge issue, and though I could have done it months ago, I chose not to for a very specific reason. It's a mind-boggling web. And to be honest, I needed more time to just take it all in. So Michelle, if you're listening, this one is for you. But before we go head first down this rabbit hole, I need to thank you, my listeners. Happy New Year. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you had a restful and healthy holiday season. This is the premiere of season 8 of this podcast. And though we've covered at least, 30 individual food products, maybe more, there are still many, many more to go. So this season, we're going to, of course, tackle corporate consolidation of our food. That's what this episode is about today. But we're also going to talk about some specific ingredients like potatoes, xylitol, and chocolate. And I know, I hear you already. Chocolate is going to be a tough one. It's going to be a tough one for me. It's going to be a tough one for you if you like chocolate. But, it is what it is. And the reason why I chose chocolate this season is because I interviewed another podcaster who we're also going to hear from this season on what's going on in the chocolate industry. And so there's that. I don't want to spoil it, so make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform right now so you don't miss an episode. I also want to just shout out my patrons on Patreon who get exclusive access to episodes before you do. And I do interviews with some of my patrons and their online audiences. So if you're into that and you want to support this show and you enjoy this information that you're not going to find anywhere else on the food industry, please consider supporting this podcast by becoming a patron on patreon.com/foodslaying. You can also support the show by subscribing to my newsletter, which is free from spam and BS, and where you get exclusive podcast updates and extra content. It's free and it's fun. So if you care about what's on your plate, sign up on foodslaying.com. Enough of that. Let's jump right in. So it wasn't easy determining the entry point on this one. So let's just start with the current landscape. Last year, in July, The Guardian did a wonderful visual explanation of the food monopolies that control our food supply. And this was a well-done article written by Nina Lakhani Alia Uitova, and Alvin Chang. And I apologize if you're listening. If I messed up your names, forgive me. But this article was complete with charts, explanations, percentages, and so on, like data, like stuff that I really like digging into. So I invite you to check it out on your own. But I'm just going to share a few of the products, industries, and stats that are covered in this article um, about the food consolidated products that are 80% consolidation or more. Okay, because there's hundreds of them, but the ones that I'm going to mention here are the ones that are consolidated by fewer than or by four or fewer big companies, and they own more than 80% of the market share in that particular industry. So let's start with chocolate and confections. And in that industry, 80% of the market is controlled by three firms: Hershey, Mars, and Lindt and Sprüngli AG. Refrigerated almond milk industry is controlled by four firms that control 81% of the market: Blue Diamond Growers, Danone, Khalifa Farms, and Coca-Cola. And it's the same for refrigerated soy milk, which is four firms control 81% of the market, and those are Danone, Stremix, Heritage Foods, HP Hood, and Prairie Farms. The baby food industry is controlled by three firms that control 82% of the market: Abbott Laboratories, Reckitt Benckiser, and Nestle. I didn't even know this when I was doing my baby food episode a couple seasons ago, so it's just good to know who the names are. Moving on. The mayonnaise industry, if you eat mayonnaise on your sandwiches, is controlled by three firms that control 83% of the market, which are Unilever, Kraft Heinz, and McCormick. Liquid baby formula industry is controlled by three firms that control 85% of the market, which is Reckitt Benckiser, Abbott Laboratories, and Nestle. Canned tuna industry is controlled by four firms that control 85% of the market: Dongwon Industries, FCF Fisher Company, Thai Union, and Wild Planet. The microwave popcorn industry is controlled by four firms that control 87% of the market: ConAgra, Campbell Soup Company, Weaver Popcorn Company, and American Popcorn Company. The dry mac and cheese industry is also controlled by four firms that control 87% of the market, and that's Kraft Heinz, General Mills, Otsuka Pharmaceutical, and PepsiCo. And now here's where we get into the big numbers. Let's talk about dips like salsa, cheese dips, and the like. The industry is controlled by four firms that control 91% of the market. That's Pepsi, Utz, Kraft Heinz, and Campbell Soup Company. Carbonated soft drinks industry is controlled by three firms that control 93% of the market. That's Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Keurig/Dr. Pepper. The single-serve canned Sloppy Joe sauce industry is controlled by four firms that control 94% of the market: ConAgra, Del Monte, Hormel, and ConAgra, which is interesting, twice in this category, which means they really own 92% of this industry alone. The single-serve pasta dishes industry is also controlled by four firms that control 94% of the market. Also ConAgra, Campbell Soup Company, Barilla, and General Mills. Is it Barilla or Barilla? Barilla is probably what it is. And General Mills. Single-serve yogurt and yogurt drinks industry is controlled by four firms that control 97% of the market: the Mom Group, Hanes Celestial Group, the Ricky Joy Company, and OKF Corporation. And drum roll, the dry dinner mixes with meat industry is controlled by four firms that control 98% of the market: ConAgra, General Mills, Vigo Importing, and Brooklyn Bottling Company. The end. So those are the top companies that own 80% or more of these specific food categories, these industries, right? So now we know who some of the major players are in the industries that bring food products into the food supply chain, many of whom we heard over and over again. So let's take a step back and look at how we got here, because we can do the research on who these companies are. And in fact, in a lot of my episodes, I talk about some of these companies. I was surprised to see one specific company, Otsuka Pharmaceutical, in the dry mac and cheese industry. It surprised me, things that I know about Otsuka. It was just interesting. But anyway, all right. So first, let's talk economics because we got to follow the money. So lobbyists, that is by and large how these companies gain majority control over these industries. Now, for comparison, in 1992, lobbyists spent $29 million to lobby our politicians. Ultimately, these lobbyists, with their millions that they make from the sales of these products, well, it's really not the lobbyists that make the money, it's the companies that make the money from the sale of the products, right? And then they give the money to the lobbyists to make these campaign contributions to our politicians to do sometimes nefarious and irresponsible things like creating laws that lead to prioritizing profits over worker safety, food safety, sustainability measures, and consumer rights. And in less than 3 decades during the 2020 election cycle, that 29 million increased sixfold to 175 million. So economically, as their profits grow, consolidation grows, as does the few at the top's political power and influence grows. There's a correlation there. But what's the impact of that? So laws and governance are controlled by the corporations. It's pay to play. So local products like, let's just say, a specialty hot sauce or jam or a beverage from your neighborhood, producer, they can't compete with that. And what's worse is that a local product hasn't even made it onto the shelf yet because in many cases it can't afford to be made thanks to many of the legislative red tape, regulations and food safety regulations, permits and certification fees. It's just really expensive to bring a ready to drink or ready to eat product to the market, right? So let's say, though, that a small producer makes something that is a hit and it does make it to the local grocery store shelves. What happens next is that product is faced with the competition at the grocery store. So let's say it's hot sauce, right? It has to compete with the 25 or 30 other choices on the shelf. It isn't owned by the big four, so it can't afford things like slotting fees, which are enormous in some cases, just so that products can occupy prime grocery store real estate on the shelves. For example, being at eye level or having a end cap, right? Or being in a specific place in the store. You pay enormous fees for that exposure. And you're also competing with, many, many SKUs from sometimes the same company, right? Because there's only 4 big players in the market. So they own a lot of different brands. And although they might look like different brands, they're really falling under the same umbrella. So if you're a small producer and you're trying to get a product on the grocery shelves and to actually get purchased by people so that you can run your business and pay for all these things, right? You don't really have the economic power that a lot of these big companies have. But I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole. It's complicated. But up until the 1990s, most people They shopped at local mom and pop stores, and there were a few regional grocery stores, right? Now, Walmart, Costco, Kroger, and Ahold Delhaize control 65% of the grocery store market. And as many of the surviving mom and pop shops that made it up until 2020, good for them, because Walmart raked in a whopping $341 billion last year. Just let that settle in your bones for a quick second. This is Walmart. $341 billion in 2020. And that's 3% up from 2019. And let's not forget, it's the Walmarts, the Krogers, the Costcos, and the Sam's Clubs that are the real beneficiaries of government aid, aka food stamps and tax benefits. So we, the taxpayers, contributed more than $64 billion to their revenues in 2020. Can you imagine if the small mom and pop shops across the United States together collectively had made $64 billion in America? How that would change the game for a lot of small businesses and families and local economies. But let's not go daydreaming, because that's not going to happen. And I haven't even gotten into the weeds regarding the meat industry. Right? But if you're a regular listener to this podcast, then you know that I cover the meat industry in depth in many other episodes, and I encourage you to listen to them. I've probably done at least 5 episodes, on the meat industry. I've done several on beef. I did one on pork. I did one on fish. I did at least one on chicken. And we know from these episodes that there are just 4 multinational corporations that control the meat and meat processing industry. And I'll say them again, just in case you're new here. They are Cargill, JBS, Tyson, and National Beef. And in 2017, these 4 major corporations raked in $207 billion in combined revenues, with Cargill dominating at over $100 billion in revenues that year alone. So while they're raking in the revenues, they're simultaneously paying farmers and ranchers less, right? They're paying lobbyists to get the regulations in their favor so that they can do what they're doing. But farmers and ranchers aren't getting what they used to get for their meat. In the 1980s, farmers were paid about $4.50 a pound, right? And now they're getting just over $2 a pound. Yet consumer prices have remained steady and even rising in the past few years. And the pandemic made things much, much worse, especially for farmers. In fact, I read recently, this was pre-pandemic, so this isn't necessarily an example of how the pandemic made the meat industry more consolidated or worse, because I've talked about that in previous issues. But this next example highlights the consolidation issue behind the labels, behind the meat that we think we're eating, has built a brand, a brand name that stands for quality and freshness and animal welfare, that just, went the way of the dodo bird. So I read this story recently that one of the premier natural meat companies that's been around since the early 1970s had major issues under its new ownership. So it used to be owned by a guy named Bill Neiman. If you know Neiman Ranch, because you live in the West, on the West Coast or in California, in the Bay Area especially, right, then you know Neiman Ranch. It was big. And it started, though, as a small farm in Bolinas, California. Bill Neiman, he was a teacher. He invested $18,000 in his initial, land purchase and some animals, and he bartered, for some animals and in exchange for tutoring. So interesting little backstory. But over the years, it grew into a company, a multi-million-dollar company, providing meats all across Northern California, and most notably to Alice Waters' restaurant Chez Panisse, and also to the Chipotle restaurant chain. Now, in 2006, the company was purchased by Natural Food Holdings. Do you know who owns Natural Food Holdings? I'll let you guess. No, I'm going to tell you. It's Purdue. Okay? So this is the prime example of how things go awry. Because in 2010, Neiman Ranch subsequently suffered from an embezzlement scandal, and the treasurer of the company, the person responsible for performing a fiduciary duty, he had responsibility to govern the money, right? He was federally indicted. So, you know, even the companies that you think are doing good because maybe you've heard their name, or maybe you used to know them for doing something good, or maybe you like their label because their marketing looks really slick and clean, and they put on a happy face when the camera comes on. You know, nothing is ever what it seems. You know, you can't get caught up in the fray because, money is a funny thing. It's just a funny thing. You know, it it's you know, we could say that money is the reason that all of this happens like this, but it's people who make decisions. It's people who spend money. It's people who say yes or no to laws or legislation that is good for citizens, taxpayers, people who are paying these people's salaries. It's the people. It's not the money. But anyway, I get off topic here. I found a quote from Joe Maxwell, president of Family Farm Action, and he says, quote, "Consumer choice is an illusion. The transnationals control everything in this extractive agricultural model," end quote. Couldn't be a truer statement. This model, this extractive agricultural model, has grave consequences for animal welfare, our water, our air, and our soil. And thanks to the vertical integration of these behemoths, they control everything along the food supply chain, from the birthing of livestock or to the growing of, these input crops, these commodity crops. They control the feed and the feed inputs, so they control the land that grows fields and fields of monocrops of corn and soy, which, 99% of it is inedible for humans, so it's primarily used as feed for livestock, corn sweetener production, and ethanol. They own the meat processing plants, and they own the distribution lines for their products. If it's not a meat product, there are many companies that still have this vertical integration where they own so many components of the food supply chain. But there was one turning point in agriculture, and this is where we're going to dip into a little bit of history. You remember in the beginning of the episode, I talked about the Nixon administration. And there was a turning point that came during the 1970s, during the Nixon and Ford administration, because, of course, Nixon got ousted after the Watergate scandal and Ford came in, right? But at the time, the Secretary of Agriculture was a guy by the name of Earl Butz. Now, he's famous for saying, quote, "Get big or get out," end quote. And he's just one significant factor in creating the subsidization and industrialization of our food supply. And during his time in office, he dramatically changed agricultural policy. Now, in a book by the name of Food Fight, written by Daniel Imhoff, published in 2007, he says, quote, The Farm Bill is actually succeeding at one of its decades-old policy objectives, driving small to medium-scale commodity farmers off the land, because Earl Butz urged farmers to plant commodity crops such as corn from fence row to fence row. These policy shifts coincided with the rise of major agribusiness corporations and the declining financial stability of the small family farm. End quote. So, by giving rise to the overproduction of corn, right, because we're at that place now, there's so much corn that's being produced that we people are finding new ways to use the surplus, and that's been happening for decades. So, we've got this overproduction of corn. We're giving government subsidies to these farmers so that they can go big, right? That gave us all this corn so that they can feed it to pigs, chickens, cattle, right? In an effort to raise them in less time, right? In a shorter amount of time, using fewer financial resources. But no one considered the environmental impacts, including the massive waste problem like the spray fields in North Carolina. If you've never heard of that, just Google that, right? The spray fields in North Carolina, where the CAFO there, they spray fecal matter into the air. It's absurd, right? So the neighbors are basically trapped inside their homes for days on end just to avoid being sprayed with pig shit. Excuse my French. That was English, but excuse me. There was just no other way to say it. These people, right? They didn't consider planting, the billions of acres of commodity crops such as corn from fence row to fence row and what that would look like. These policy shifts coincided with the rise of major agribusiness corporations and the declining financial stability of the small family farm. The health and nutritional quality of our food, the impacts of high fructose corn syrup has on our health and our teeth, the depletion of our soil from the monocrops and the pesticides that are used to control weeds, to the lack of nutritional density in our fruits and vegetables, to, turning a blind eye to worker safety, slave labor, like so on and so on and so on. It just goes on and on, all from commodity farmers going big or going home. This leads me to one thing that I think is a really interesting externality from this expansion of corporate control of our food supply. And if you think about it, you might have noticed it too. So I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who listens to my podcast from time to time. And she was telling me a story about how she purchased some ground turkey from a local shop where she lives, and she paid $18 for a little over a pound of pasture-raised organic ground turkey. Now that sounds crazy. $18 for a pound of ground turkey? And she said, and I get it, right? Not everybody can pay $18 for 1 pound of ground turkey. That's a lot of money for a pound of ground turkey. But she said it was the best $20 that she'd spent on food in a while. Comparatively, she mentioned that the previous ground turkey that she got from Whole Foods tasted like nothing. It didn't taste like anything. It just had no flavor at all. So the point of the story is that most of the food that we eat, even the things you can find in these healthier stores, it has corn in it somewhere, right? Meat in particular no longer has any distinctive taste because most of it is fed a diet of corn and soy. So it tastes like corn and soy. You think about tomatoes, for example. That's a really good example. They're not fed corn and soy, but they're grown in greenhouses or they're grown in monocrops and they're harvested before the sugars develop in them. So they get sprayed and they're artificially ripened. And so, if you've ever tasted a tomato, that you've grown yourself or that you purchase from a farmer's market, there's no comparison. There's no flavor there. Food that is allowed to grow naturally in a polyculture, meaning among other plants and other beneficial microorganisms and life forms, or animals that are raised on pasture or free ranging and eating intuitively and eating what they're designed to eat, they just taste better, right? It's like wine and terroir, right? There's that thing with wine and terroir. I don't even know how to say it. It's a French word, terroir, and it's about the region where the grapes grow and the how they take on the flavor of the land, right? Because of what's in the soil. And you can taste it, and you can taste it in the grapes, you can taste it in the wine, just like you can taste it in the tomatoes, or you can taste it in a strawberry, you can taste it in some ground beef or ground turkey, for that matter, when an animal is raised humanely, on pasture or in its natural environment. Not to mention, let me just end with cows for a second. They're ruminants, by the way. And if you don't know what a ruminant is, that's an animal that eats vegetation and notably grass, right, and pasture. So they're not designed to eat corn and soy. Digestively speaking, it destroys their stomachs and their immune systems, and it's a terrible, inhumane consequence of Earl Butts's policies. That's how we got cattle and pigs and chickens in these CAFOs being fed cheap corn and soy mash, right? Basically food waste, or ethanol waste, or whatever it is. They're eating this stuff. It's not even good for them, and it doesn't make our meat taste any better. So I'll get off that meat soapbox and get back to corporate consolidation. So we see it everywhere in society. And I've just given you several examples of how it destroys the environment. But here's some other things to consider. Corporate consolidation of our food also puts workers in danger. Some of the most dangerous and lowest paying jobs are at these mega companies, both nationally and internationally. If you've ever visited one of these mega meat factories, they cause unnecessary harm to animals, which admittedly, I've not ever actually stepped foot into one of these places, primarily because I have no desire to see animals living in those types of conditions. I just don't. Like, I like animals. I love my animals. And I think I'd throw up, and I'd get angry, and I'd probably cry a little. But I've read enough reports and studies to know that what goes on in these places isn't humane by my standards and by the standards of many, many people who enjoy eating beef, pork, chicken, and turkey, and so on. Much of this consolidation causes increases in consumer prices for food without an increase in quality or nutrition. So the price of our food is going up, but we're certainly not seeing an increase in the quality of our food or the nutritional density of our food. People aren't getting more food for their money, nor are they getting better quality for their money, right? It's basically a bunch of cheap, empty calories filled with corn and soy byproducts being consumed by the most vulnerable stakeholders and eaters in society: babies, the elderly, and the poor. This consolidation creates dangerous food safety issues thanks to the contamination and poor food handling that can create the conditions for deadly bacteria, fungi, bugs, fecal matter, and pesticide residue to enter our food supply chain without much oversight, without much being done to mitigate those risks for consumers. Of course, there are food product recalls, but if you listen to my food recalls episode, many of those recalls are not mandatory, they're voluntary. So there's that. And then there's the externalities from this corporate consolidation that continues to put farmers and ranchers at risk financially. And in some cases, farmers have to sell their land to these, bullies and, investors, or worse, right? because they don't have any choice. This is their retirement. They've worked their whole lives on the land, and the marketplace has been flooded with corporate consolidation, right? And this money and lobbyists forcing them to grow things that they're maybe getting paid a fair price for, maybe not getting paid a fair price for, and they're going into debt. They're getting burdened with debt. They're suffering the impacts of that with their mental health, right? And in some cases, taking their own lives. Like it's a serious problem, right? And then there's the health impacts of this corporate food consolidation. And I swear I could go on and on and on. And some people think that becoming a vegetarian will help reduce some of these risky and dangerous externalities. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I've been a vegetarian. I started in that place. I was teaching vegetarian cooking. So I understand being vegetarian, being vegan. It is a great gateway to becoming healthy. Really, it's a gateway to getting off the industrialized food chain. But then again, is it? I mean, certainly eating plants can provide you with more fiber and, in some cases, increased nutrients. But vegetables also have some of these same issues. In many cases, the issues are even more egregious because there are crops that are sprayed with pesticides and herbicides and other contaminants that linger in the food as residue that you wind up consuming that are very, very dangerous to your health. You know, there are many vegetarian foods that are imported from thousands of miles away that have huge carbon footprints, and they're sold to us in layers upon layers of non biodegradable packaging, right? Our food gets maybe it gets grown here, but then it gets exported to a place where there's cheap labor. It gets packaged and processed, and then it gets shipped back to us for our consumption. This isn't just happening with meat, you know? So we have to keep these things in mind. Many vegan and vegetarian alternatives to meat are highly processed and include ingredients with complicated names, right? If you listen to my vegetable oils episode, then you know that vegetable oils are a nightmare. I encourage you to go listen to that, right? A lot of vegetarians, they don't want to use butter, or they don't want to use beef tallow, or they don't want to use lard. And, rightfully so. We have this illusion of choice. But it's it's so nuanced. It's not just cut and dry. It's not just like, oh, well, I'm going to be a vegan or vegetarian because ethically I don't like what's happening with these CAFOs and these animals. And that is a valid concern and a really good reason to ditch the industrialized meat industry. I get it. That's was one of my motivators for becoming a vegetarian. It wasn't until I started to understand the landscape of what's actually going on and to understand what's going on with the rest of our food and that there's contaminants, whether you're vegan, vegetarian, or meat eater, whatever. It's about understanding the who, the what, where it's coming from, what's at play economically, what are the externalities, so that we as consumers can have as much information as possible so that we can make good choices, sensible choices, hopefully economically beneficial choices for the food that we put on our plates. We didn't even get to the GMO stuff that's in almost every packaged food product that you can find on the shelves, you know. But I don't want to keep going down that road. At the end of the day, there's sugars, there's fillers, there's binding agents and emulsifiers, all made from corn and soy. Not to mention, a lot of these products don't have a lot of flavor. But we got here because we as consumers stopped paying attention to what was going on with our food. We stopped supporting small local farmers. We clamored for convenience as family units broke down and parents had to work just to pay the bills. We voted for people who didn't and still don't have our best interest as a top priority. We decided that cheap food was better than quality food. And what did we get? Garbage. We got mountains of food and animal waste. We got corruption and manipulation. We get deforestation in places like Brazil and Mozambique because soybean is being grown there by the hundreds of thousands of hectares, controlled by, of course, only 5 corporations, including Bunge, Monsanto, ADM, Cargill, and Dreyfus. And it's being exported primarily to China to feed their pigs and their people. So it makes you wonder, do these companies care about us? It's hard to tell. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg discussion because without eaters to eat the food that's being produced, they won't rake in these mega revenues. And although they would still rake in money from subsidies and government programs, if we stopped supporting them, that might send a clear message. But there's impacts to that as well. And the reality is, that's just not going to happen. People need to eat. And these companies, they exploit that fact. They have people so burdened with debt that whoever is responsible for earning income in the household must continue to work. So there's no time to do much else. They realize they need to undercut small farmers because of what matters to most people, even people who do have the means to purchase locally produced food at higher prices. It's the cost that gets you, right? So no matter where you are economically, you're still consumed with the cost of food, the rising cost of food. I mean, $20 a pound for ground turkey is absurd by any means, and most people can't afford it. So people buy what they can afford. They try to get the best of what they can afford. Unfortunately, there's a lot behind the curtain. And it's a pickle. I get it. It's nuanced and it's complicated, and there's no clear answer for everyone. And if you remember my episode with the agricultural economist Michelle Klieger, we talked about this very issue, and her suggestion was to buy quality over quantity. Now, this doesn't have to mean that you eat less, but if you can substitute half of your consumption with better quality food, chances are in the long run, you'll drive down your healthcare costs. So you either pay it forward or you pay for it in higher costs and sometimes worse health outcomes later, right? So you either pay for it now or you pay for it later. So here's what I suggest. Read your labels and educate yourself. Try to know exactly what you're eating if you can't take responsibility for producing it yourself, which most of us can't. You can also continue listening and sharing these episodes with people that you love. I really try to bring good information to the table. You can consume fewer empty calories and just choose more substantive calories. So that means, maybe we don't eat as many snacks, right? And we just try to eat whole food like fruits and vegetables and, things that are not highly processed. You can also prepare your own food from scratch using good quality ingredients. You can also buy in bulk to save money. And just do your research, right? When you find a company that's doing good, let them know by purchasing from them. Contact them, communicate with them, ask them questions. Most companies that are doing good don't mind offering transparency, right? Because good deeds are done in the light. Okay? Okay? Just a quick little anecdote. Because people are always talking to me about, oh, well, I can't afford, expensive meat. I barely can afford food anyway. One of the things Earl Butz is known for is that he got the cost of food down so low that Americans spend about 17% of their take-home pay on food, right? So they can spend 83% on other things. And, before he came, on the scene, people were spending a lot more on food. So now we're not paying as much, but we're also not getting as much good food. So people, when you talk about the economics of the food supply, among food consolidation, one of the benefits is that we have cheap food. But here's a funny thing. So I had a friend who purchased a quarter share of beef from a local farmer. Now, this person lives in a two-person household and probably eats beef once a week and is low income. Okay, I just want to set the stage for this. Two-person household eats beef once a week and is low income, right? Okay, let's put that aside for a second. So my friend shared this quarter beef with another person. So together, these two families purchased a quarter of a whole cow and they split it 50-50. So the total, that's what's called a herd share. If you've never heard of that before, you can do that where you live, find a local farmer, rancher, person who's raising cattle, see if they have a herd share program, and you can learn more about that. Fantastic. So the total quarter of that cow, that cow was about 110 pounds of beef. That's what it yielded, right? It yielded some really great cuts of beef. So for each person splitting the quarter, they took home about 55 pounds each, right? Maybe 12 pounds of ground beef, about 4 or 5 pounds of really great steaks like New York strip, prime rib, a couple of roasts, some cube meat for stews, some special treats like short ribs, carne asada, flank steak, and brisket. Okay, it sounds like a lot, but it was about 50 to 55 pounds of beef. You know, a third of it was ground beef. Do you know how much it cost each person? I'm going to tell you. So for the 55 pounds, and this was 100% pastured beef, no corn, no soy ever, between the fee that went directly to the farmer, plus the butchering and the cut fees that went directly to the butcher in the local economy, it was all under $6 a pound, including the transportation to go and pick it up from the local butcher. So all each of these families have to pay for at this point is the electricity to keep the freezer going, right? And if you've been to the grocery store and you've bought beef, ground beef, that's organic, then it's about $5, $6, maybe $7 a pound, right? And you certainly can't buy any organic or grass-fed steaks for $6 a pound. You can't buy any roasts for that. You know, so the price is, it's one flat fee, and it's across all of those cuts, and you just have to pick it up. So you can't beat that. And there's so many upsides. It's crazy to me that more people aren't doing this. You know, there's so many upsides to it. It keeps the money local in the community. It helps, people keep jobs in the community. It's a better product. It tastes great. It's got a circular loop for waste. There's just so many upsides. I hope you consider doing that in, your community where you live. Because it's not the cow, baby. It's the how. Anyway, it's very clear by now to see that our food is corporately controlled by companies that have their best interests in mind, not ours. The consolidation of these companies has not only given us as consumers the illusion of choice, but it has increased the price of our foods across the board without improving the nutritional quality of our food. It's also clear that the way that our food has become almost 100% industrially produced is costing us our health and the health of our ecosystem, the health of our water, our air, and our soil. So economically, ecologically, and our longevity as healthy humans and animals has all been and will continue to be impacted unless we do something differently. We can always turn to our local and rural producers and increase the viability of small local family farms, increase the economic viability of our communities, and find food freedom. And I encourage you all to do that as often as you can. And on that note, I'd like to thank you again for listening in to today's episode, the Season 8 premiere of Food Slang, talking about the corporate consolidation of our food. This season, we're going to talk about a lot of interesting foods and how these foods get to our plates. But in the meantime, remember to please share this episode with someone you love. And remember to eat clean, liberate yourself and your food from corporate control, chemical contamination, and marketing manipulation. And I'll see you on the other side of the plate. Ciao.